Inasmuch as if in some strange way life continued to push along the lines that I have been trying to help push, then you could say that if things stayed the same and then changed, which is the only way you can describe how things three-dimensionally could be otherwise. You people on tape understand that, right? If things could be just like they are and then change, but if they could change, so they wouldn't be just like they are, but follow me. If it did proceed along the kinds of lines that I have been suggesting and hinting, then psychology would have to become biology, biology would have to become chemistry, and chemistry would have to become physics, as it is now, being kind of the basic. But then, if it went any further than that, which it'd have to if it even started this progression, didn't have to be a new one, which I'd suggest would be, if not necessarily us doing it now at some other time, this form of this, and it would have to be called what? And I thought about it. And at first I came up with the name of a new religion, my finger's in your eye, but then I discounted that. Back to the world of academia. Then, after it went from psychology into biology, that is, you understand that biology would overtake. Psychologists have to drop and become biology. But then very shortly after that, biologists have to look around and go, well, wait a minute. And it'd have to become chemistry. Just never mind to be no biology, be chemistry. And then chemistry would go, wait a minute. You know, this is physics. Just, why are we fooling around? But then, if it went one more stage, it would be this kind of activity if it, in some way, ever got in the mainstream of life. And I was trying to think, and it would have to be, how you like this? Non-specific physics. I kind of liked it. They won't like it. I guess all this is still a preface. But if I don't ever say otherwise, I can just press on and we'll never leave the preface. Or we will leave the preface and go into the body of tonight's sermon, lecture, commentary, and no one will ever know the difference. Until anybody, you people getting this on tape at some other time in some other place, the background of all this, who knows? If you missed it, these hundreds and hundreds of tapes that I've stood here and made, then to tell you the truth, I can't go back tonight. We're a little pushed for time and catch you up. But let me say that on this planet at this time, if anyone does not understand that all human activity, all behavior can be not only explained, which is not necessarily the best word for ordinary people, but it can be measured, which is even better, molecularly. Until you understand that, until you know that, you don't know anything. That everything, religion, psychological problems, deviant behavior, non-deviant behavior, being middle class, being more or less than middle class, being happy, being sad, it can all be measured molecularly. Whether you were wired up generally to be caught into feeling that most of life's impact came on the individual from externally, or whether you thought in some way that you were more introspective and you thought, well, most of what goes on in some way bubbles up inside of me. It doesn't matter until you realize that even if we took the former view, if we said that almost everything that happens to you, well, maybe that's going too far for most of you newer people, but a good part of what happens to you is the impact of the environment, which is not some kind of chemical reaction. And yes, it is. Until you understand that no matter what happens, or to go back to an example, if it helps some of you again, if you took what would seem to be the most unworldly, the most non-mundane affair that people used to believe, your forefathers, that God spoke to you, is that transcendental enough? If God spoke to you, in private, like he did Moses, if he didn't even say it out loud, you just heard him in your head, like Jim Baker did before the recent difficulties. If God spoke to you, it wouldn't amount to anything until it had the kind of molecular effect on your senses, in your brain, that you went, oh, yeah, all right. So no matter how you cut it, being alive in this world at this time, even if you tried to imagine the most transcendental experience, if you believe that I have seen somebody from another planet, I saw a flying saucer, you just said it, I saw it. If you didn't see it, you didn't see it. If you didn't see it, it doesn't exist. if it does not fall within the measurable angstroms or whatever they are in the visible light, an electromagnetic band to where you can see, feel, touch, and all that, if it doesn't fall within that, it doesn't exist. Therefore, I'm saying, in the beginning, until a person knows that no matter what happens, no matter what seems to arise from out there without even questioning it, whether it does or not, or what seems to arise within here, none of it actually exists. You have got the point-blank reality, in another way of the old Zen question of, is there a sound when a tree falls in the forest by itself? Nothing, no tree falls. No tree smells, no tree touches you, no tree sings, no tree has any taste unless you can touch, smell, taste, hear, feel it. And that's that. It seems simple enough when I point it out, surely. Even at ordinary speeds, if somebody's really listening to what I just said, you just can't get around it. What is interesting as a side note again, as I point out many times, those who might really be properly attracted to this, what's really interesting is to go, yeah, by God, you're right. You may get weirder in a minute, but that's true. I just never thought about it. And then not to be astounded that you never thought about it. Like, God almighty, you should fall down and faint when you think about that. That all the things that you and apparently every other civilized, intelligent person believes is somewhere far away from this. Or if it apparently gets close, it just nibbles around its selective edges and it never puts it all together. Because it believes there is some kind of sensual life, all the way from religious basis, of there being a difference between a kind of sensual, crude life and then some sort of vague, spiritual, potential life. And if there was this latter, it wouldn't exist if there is a heaven. You're not going to know about it unless the damn thing can be seen, or unless you go there and you still got some senses. It might as well not be. Or contrarily, you can forget about Hades and the Inferno if it is that kind of vague thing that it's in some way separate from your mundane existence. Because if you don't carry your mundane existence with you, and there is a life, as they call it, after death, and you have been selected to go down there and meet with those great poets and people that tried to make things rhyme that didn't. And you go down there, it's not going to serve its purpose unless you carry along this old mundane baggage. You're not going to get burned. You're not going to suffer. You should be astounded, ordinary people, when they first hear that and go, yeah, it's just plain as hell. Then be astounded, I never thought about it. Then a kind of post-battlefield flashback, a few minutes later, a few hours later, the next day, is to realize, as astounded as I was when I heard that, when I fainted, I hadn't even thought about it since then. Then you should be doubly astounded. That how is it that you can once see that nothing exists? Forget all these dreams, not only religiously, but in the sense that in some way emotions, or imagination, or dreams, or intelligence is something. So, for instance, intelligence is something other than simply the operations of the human brain. What? Well, don't be some kind of crude philosopher that believes that everything is just mechanical. We're getting to that. But people are not astounded. Many people, when the first time they think about it in that way, if I make it clear enough, can go, hey, that's kind of interesting, and I'll try to remember that. You don't realize what's going on. That to hear that everything that seems to be so non-specifically based in life, all the questions, all of the crude answers, all the unsatisfying answers, all of the inexplicable, inhumane behavior, all the things that seem to be on some kind of other level. Religions support it. Human intelligence supports that there is some kind of just ordinary life where you get gas, you get acne, you cut yourself, you trip, you get old. There's all that. But for an intelligent, sophisticated person, there's something else. What? Well, there's other things. There are possibilities. You can dream about another life, all right? But there's no difference in dreaming about another life than it is to go, God, I ate too much pizza. It's the same thing. Or what's that strange noise? Is that God or is that my intestinal tract? It's the same thing. Until somebody realizes that everything, that's why I gave you a little room when I said is explainable by molecular action. I don't mean in the sense that to an ordinary intelligence explains everything, because I'm about to get to that. But it measures. There is nothing that cannot be measured. There is nothing, by the way, even biology. Medicine is getting close to this. It won't do them any good. They probably got enough statistical information experiments now that they actually are there being what I was going to say, that they can create, by electrodes in certain brain areas, anything, whether they believe they've done it yet or not, anything. They can make God talk to you. They can suddenly make you aggressive. They can suddenly put you to sleep. Surely all of you know that. That's no secret. That's been going on for 3 or 4 decades now, just piecemeal. As I said, since it's not ordinary intelligence's purpose to start confronting the kinds of things that we're trying to do here, that I'm trying to point you towards, they will never put together in some way and come up on their own and just say, well, hey, everything is molecularly based, no matter what it is. But they've already done it. No matter anything that humans have ever thought, things that they've experienced, you can lay there on an operating table and then go zap, and they hit the right place, and you believe that such and such has happened, as you think that it happened. They can do that. But when I say that until you understand that you can be measured in that way molecularly, that you don't know anything, there's another step that I wanted to throw in with a preface. Until you further realize that all these questions that this would seem to beg, does man have any freedom at all? Is he at all responsible for what he does, or is he not? Until you understand that that question goes way beyond the world's most grandiose attempt to define moot and useless. Until you understand that, then you understand even less than I said you did, which was nothing. Until you understand, because where I started out would seem to present again that question. Then wait a minute. Then if I did follow what you said, and even it struck me that that is true, that I agreed, that anything that happens to humans, even the privacy in their own brain of believing that they're talking to God, for instance, you are right, it has got to go through the regular molecular process in the brain. It's got to go through the human senses, or you can't receive it. You wouldn't know it. God could holler, can you hear me? Can you hear me? And if something had happened, maybe you took too many drugs last night, you drank too much and you're passed out, and there's your one chance of God saying, damn it, can you hear me? I was going to tell you something. And you couldn't. Or you had a small concussion. You just weren't on the right wavelength. It wouldn't do any good. So that would seem to present again that kind of unanswerable question, that wait a minute, if that's true then, and that all we are is just our own internal molecular activity, even when it seems to be stimulated from without, then that means we got no freedom. And then it goes into things like, well, wait a minute, we got some freedom. I couldn't even consider the question of whether we got no freedom at all. Oh, gee, I'm getting confused again. I should have tried to stay awake back during Philosophy 101 when I was in school. I should think more. I should drink less. Until you understand that there is no form of three-dimensional intelligence, molecularly earth-bound intelligence, that can answer those questions. And it's not the question's fault. It is the erroneous premise to start with. And erroneous, for you people on tape, is not that humans made a mistake. It's that it is lacking information. It is flawed questions. Not because people are mistaken, but they do not have enough information to ask the right question. The question of whether is man free or not is no question. That's a hobby. That's a churning up of your intellectual accounts. It's the kind of thing that life does through everyone. That just seems to be one of the real questions. If that sounds too dry and philosophical, it's just a variation of your forefathers. You know, is there actually a God or not? And if there is a God, does he really pay attention to us, or did he just wind up this whole thing and he walked away from it? If so, there's so many things that you can't explain. How I woke up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat and the phone rang and I knew my mother had died. how I walked in a room and looked around and thought, boy, I've been here before. And then later I walked in another room, looked around and went, I've never even seen this place before. It's all very strange and confusing. All right, based on all that, I'll wrap up the premise here, since we're almost out of time tonight, and say that from all of that I have tried to point you toward from a variety of positions, then there are some things that you would naturally think, that you may have never put in words, but I'm going to for you in just a second, that you would think would follow from that, and they don't. So to use our springboard tonight, it struck me do a variation of that great American sort of, I guess I'm safe to say, kind of a philosophical musical drama of a cute thing happened on the way to the forum. And one of the songs, but we'll change it tonight, is Sociology Tonight. Here comes the body of the text. We'll start. I'm calling it sociology just so that you'll try and give it the benefit of a different twist, and I'm going to point at something that, as I said, if you'd ever thought about it in this way, at first when you hear this you'd think, well, no, something's amiss there. Here it goes. Well, first I can give you a kind of a law. At a certain stage of increased complexity, things can take on a new dimension. Now this is way beyond Earth physics, but it's a fact. Jack. Take on an additional dimension. And it operates like this. I'm going to go ahead and talk about Earth. That's why I went ahead and said sociology, to give it a basis of things already extant here. Here's the thing that, if any of you had thought along these lines, that you would believe would go in a certain direction, and it does not. And it's this, that groups, collections of people, institutions, which are still cellular, molecular, living collections, but all such groups, societies, institutions are more than their combined individual parts. In this case, they're more than the individuals in there. Don't feel bad that you don't think you've got it yet, because we're just starting. That would seem, to ordinary intelligence, if it was following what I'd talked about in the preface, would seem to be, if not unlikely, well, unlikely might be the weakest case to be made, the weakest statement. It might be striking ordinary intelligence as impossible vis-a-vis what I had already stated. That if indeed the human, the individual human, and specifically that which makes a human human, the higher end of the nervous system, the operations of the brain itself, if it is inescapably tied to molecular activity, whether the stimuli seems to be internal or external, if that be true, then collections of people, a small group of people, a whole society of people, or within the whole society, certain institutions, professions, groups that band together, the group itself, the collection of people, are still a collection of these creatures run by molecular activity. And there's nothing magical has happened just because you, instead of one person, now that you've got 10 or 12 or 15. When it reaches a certain stage of increased complexity, things can take on an additional dimension. Look at this. I will agree beforehand, if any of you want a warning, I can smell dangerous subtleness creeping all over parts of the British Isles. Well, where they'll say such things as subtle. But don't let it get into your whales or you're in trouble. What we were already talking about is individual humans, experts in their field, people with academic credentials, and you cannot answer the individual question, cannot answer the question once it's asked. Is man free, is a man free, or mankind free and responsible for what they do individually? It cannot be answered. Now you know that without me having to go through any more. Just the kind of examples and the kinds of flows of thought that run through the human intellect that I already mentioned in the preface. That people can, at one time, an individual can hear this and go, well, people are responsible, people are free, they can decide what to do. But then if they pursue that just a second, they run across, if nothing else, to begin with, themselves. They have to reflect on that, and they know at their times that I absolutely was not free. I don't know what caused it, but especially you talking about those kind of molecular activities, that yeah, you can be. I've had it happen to me that I was tired. I'd been flying overnight, went through jet lag, and I suddenly turned very aggressive to a cabbie that offered me a ride as I was walking out of the airport. And I am not that aggressive. That was not me to take the kind of stuff you were just talking about. It was like my molecular structure at that time, because of imbalances in certain hormones, certain neural transmitters. It was as though not I'm not making an excuse now, a person could say, an intellectual, reasonable person could say, I am not actually making an excuse for behavior, but in a sense, I did not behave that way. It was my out of whack neural transmitters. It was some of my hormonal balances were out of balance. And the person is stating a reasonable sketch of molecular reality. The point being, no individual, and they do not have to be professional philosophers, but all the way in the Western world, from our Platos, all the way up to you, to even people in the fields of religion, if they're still going on, that try to think, end up with this, that you cannot definitively answer, is man individually and collectively, but is a man free? Is he responsible for everything he does? All you can do is end up and say, well, yeah. Well, he should be. Most of the time he is. But, you know, by God, there are some circumstances. You know, like I was telling you about me and the jet lag. My kid sometime, or my wife. Somebody has a hard day. And you can say, well, wait a minute. We all have a hard day. To say that somebody was stressed out today, does that explain, does that excuse? And are you changing your story now? Did you say you walked in the house and hollered, "Hon, I'm home"? You closed the door and she hollered, "God damn, don't slam the door." And you go, Jesus, I didn't slam the door to start with. And then she says, hey, I just burned supper. Your mother's sick, a whole bunch of stuff. And so I'd say, well, wait a minute. And not just because she's your wife. This could be somebody at work. But are you saying now that she was not fully free? That she was not responsible? You're going to give her an excuse. You're going to give her a chit to allow her out of this little episode. And a person can say, well, all right, people have got to be free. Not philosophically and not in the old 60s sense. But you've got to say that people are free and responsible for what they do. But now that I go into it, there does seem to be kinds of examples to where, I don't know, it's the kind of stresses that can make you just temporarily act in a way in which you wouldn't. But then, if they were really trying to deal with this, I'd have to say, well, wait a minute. Stress is like rain. Everybody's supper gets burned, etc. And they'd have to say, yeah, I guess you're right. And that your life is no more stressful than somebody over here. Okay. So why is it that you're going to say under specific conditions, you, your wife, even a stranger, acted in such a way that you are going to allow them that kind of untoward behavior that they may even apologize for, and they kind of shrug or won't say, hey, I don't know what came over me, I've been real tired. And you go, oh, well, okay, I know what you mean. So then, the individual intellect trying to deal with this has got to come to this conclusion, that it does not know. That an individual, and I don't mean just you, I mean anybody, Maybe you'll hear it a little closer in just a second. But individual intelligence of all stripes, philosophers and everybody else. This is not an academic problem. The individual intelligence of no one can satisfactorily answer in any direction. Is man free and responsible for what he does, or is he not? Now, even though this, when it is really struggling against the weight of gravity, is premiseless, for tonight, right now, that is not necessarily a premise, but that's where you have to step if you're not going to fall in the bog immediately. So step right there and understand that at all ordinary levels, that's true. You cannot answer it. No one can. Trust me. They cannot. And those that do take it seriously as though it was their profession, like philosophers and sociologists and psychologists, they state it. But you might as well see, it cannot be answered. All you can do is say yes, no, or sometimes, or maybe. In other words, it cannot be definitively answered by an individual. Now here's what is not noticed. I'll say it one more time. It's not just because I say so, but you need to see it, and I'm just trying to enforce it verbally. That is simply an operational fact in the 3D world, that no individual intelligence can answer in any manner that even satisfies itself the question, is man responsible for what he does? Is he free to choose what he does? No one can answer it. The human nervous system is not wired up and structured to answer that. Now, a group can answer it, because a group does answer it. You just never noticed it in this way. Society, if you want the quick word for it. Society answers it. We all know it does. Society tells you, and when the molecules start out working, to be hateful or aggressive, sexually aroused, at a pre-speech level, the molecules and any individual doesn't know whether society is going to allow something, whether it's going to hold you responsible. It just happens. And I would seem to almost, if you were following, I guess, a pretty serious sidestep to jump over, it can't answer, am I going to be held responsible? Am I responsible for what I'm just about to do or what I just did? Hitting that guy, stealing their food, taking their money. You don't know. Am I responsible? Nobody knows. No individual. But society knows. A group of individuals that don't know get together and they do know. They pass laws. Quite specific. I mean, very specific. All of you should know this. If for nothing else, just from TV and movies and seeing little courtroom and police dramas, you can be charged. Listen, the elements of first-degree burglary are thus and thus and thus. And an attorney for this defendant will say, wait a minute, he did not actually penetrate the perimeter of the property. One of the elements of burglary. So this is not burglary. It gets very specific. And the DA's got to say, all right, wait a minute. All right, if that's true, I'm not going to haggle. All right, we're going to have to call it felonious trespassing then, which will still get your client anywhere from 1 year to 3. And then they start dealing. You've heard shit like that, stuff like that. Society, that is a group of people. Now, don't think that somebody somewhere, that Thomas Jefferson or Blackstone or Oliver Wendell Holmes, or that some individual sat down and said, well, I'm going to invent a bunch of laws, I'm going to make them up and real specific. Or saloon back in the Greek days. And any of you that has ever read about him, don't write me, it was a joke. I know it's not pronounced saloon, but it always seems sort of appropriate at the beginning of law that the Greek, given credit for being the father of the law, his name spelled in English, you could, if you were primitive enough, pronounce it saloon. I always liked it. Never mind. Of course, then you can take the father of medicine and mispronounce his name and turn it into something cynical if you were that sort. Which I can tell by looking at you people that you're not that sort. The law, that is, decisions made by a group of individuals that could not individually determine this, get together and they get very specific. That is, now you're dealing with something that is, I'm going to try and get you to see, a different creature. That a society, a group of people, when it begins to function at a certain level of complexity, is no longer merely a numerical combination of its individual parts. No, no, no. It turns a corner. It takes on an additional dimension. Society, I'll keep saying that. Remember, I'm talking about a group of individuals that did not have the ability to make a decision. Put together, they can not only make decisions very specifically, that, all right, this kind of behavior, we're holding you absolutely responsible. And if you add this kind of behavior to it, then we hold you even further responsible. Not only that, but then they give allowable excuses wherein you're not responsible. Such as, society in most parts of the world will not hold you responsible for the most heinous civilized crime of murder. If society determines, that group determines, not guilty by reason of what? Insanity. Which is saying non-responsibility. That the group can decide, not an individual. Now I know that they'll call up psychiatrists and try to get 2 or 3 opinions, or both sides maybe argue whether he's insane or not. But notice, it's not an individual anywhere. Because there is no individual on this planet. Things are not wired up. And it's got nothing to do, I'll tell you one more time, with education. It's not that we're looking around for the one guy that in some way psychiatry can never decide whether somebody's insane or not. Don't get hung up on any of these examples. It's not that. No one person can decide. It is impossible to decide whether humans, individually and as a race, are responsible for what they do, free to choose to murder, to not murder, to withhold aggression, to withhold sexual advances on someone who doesn't want it, or that they just, my genes just took over. My hormones are raging in such a way that I'm not responsible. No individual, life is not wired up to where any individual can make that determination. But you put them together, and they damn well can. No problem. Oh, yeah, they'll discuss it. They'll go into committee. If we're talking about the lawmaking body in some society somewhere, some group, they may discuss it. They may ask for witnesses to come up and testify. They may ask for experts and all kinds of opinions. But there's no doubt. You never thought about it. If they decide they're going to expand the laws against the sale and distribution of drugs, they're going to tighten it up, make it more directed toward the users. Anything you hear that they're going to change the law in some way that sounds significant. If they start holding hearings, you never thought about it this way, but there's no doubt. No one ever says, well, wait a minute, if they go through all this, they're going to get through in the committee. The subcommittee is going to come out with this report to the big committee that was going to make the report back to Congress or the Senate. You know, you just never thought about it, but the subcommittee is not going to come out and say, well, we spent X amount of days listening to testimony, we all discussed it, and we can't decide what to do. No, no, no. In other words, they will never say, well, we decided that humans are not fit or we're not intelligent enough. Not just us, we decided nobody can. Well, we think nobody can. If you guys can, give it over to another committee because we can't decide. They'll either say yes or no. The vote may be split a little bit, but that's the way it's got to be. You know that. You got to have C and D to dance. A decision will come out. A decision. But no individual is wired up to make such a decision. You put a group together, and if it's going to stay long enough, that life is going to begin to use it, and it takes on an operational identity, such as a society, is the most common form. Once it does that, that collection of individuals then that are lacking certain specific abilities I just told you, they are inherent. They are molecular. The individual intelligence of any ordinary person on this planet right now cannot make any satisfactory decision as to whether people are responsible for what they do or not. But take those same, that include the guy I just used, him and 2 or 3 other guys, 4 or 5 other women, get a couple of hundred of them, put them together, nobody even questions it after that. It happens. That group can then determine. They may debate it, as I said, that's the way it goes. And apparently they dance around the intellectual dance floor here and there, and somebody says this should be a crime, it should not, we should forbid this. All right, yeah, but if we're going to forbid it, we'll make these exceptions. All right, we'll do that. But it comes out and there is a specific determination made, enough that they write it right down, they enforce it. The society will arm people, give them the authority that you guys, you're in charge, you're now the police. You go and enforce this. If you see somebody do that, we have decided that's not allowed. The police say, yeah, well, I heard about it. I got you. They announce to the people, this is not allowed. And if such and such happens, or if it does happen, over here there are certain possible excuses. There are certain instances where this kind of behavior was probably beyond your control. When things reach a certain level of complexity, it can take on an additional dimension. And it is never noted. Life has wired people up in general so that there is a sizable attack, criticism, defiance of what we think of as society. That it is too large. Now, I don't mean just America. You could be living over now in some little old teeny island. We could be down in Grenada. Not an old population, but probably 2,000 or 3,000. And whatever government they got, you do know that if we were suddenly moved down there, we'd end up hanging around the corner somewhere, and there's already groups of people complaining about the size of big government. And their government may amount to what? 20 or 30 people working part-time, and nobody complaining about it. They complain as though there is something so extraordinarily dangerous, so oppressive, that it can't be trusted. Wow. Life having people wired up, and quite intelligent people, as you know, have made their reputations throughout history, that they're remembered now in literature and politics for great intellectual defiant acts of standing up and having a way with words, and in some way verbally, if no other way, is hollering out at the powers at that time that be of, hey. And that's what they're remembered for. Perhaps a bit more eloquently than I just did, but that's what it amounts to. Is stuff authority, stuff the crowd. And there are all sorts of proverbs that are remembered and repeated, that you cannot trust the wisdom of a crowd, or a mob has no wisdom. A mob is a raging belly without a head. Maybe I made that one up. But all those kinds of things of the distrust of society, and the Thoreaus of the world, the Rousseaus, the Erasmuses, and all the people saying that a man has got to be off alone. That society cannot decide what to do. You cannot have some kind of collective intelligence to run your life. We got to turn the tape over. All of you should know this is no defense of society, no defense of crowds, because somebody, a real explorer, somebody involved in whatever the hell this is, by and large, I'll already admit you know this, or you should fit in yourself, has got a dose somewhere of a kind of multidimensional hermetism. Most people that get really attracted to this are less than profound, vociferous lovers of crowds and mobs, and that's just the way life is wired up. So this is certainly no defense of society. Any of you who want to be a hermit, once you get past, if you're not just wired up, if you know what you're doing and won't be a hermit, don't wait for me to tell you not to. But it is right at the cutting corner of how intelligence ordinarily cannot see that collections, even if it's just two, the apparent dichotomous nature of everything that the mind thinks, that even if you did in some way put them together, that all right, I am full of contradictions. That is, I haven't worked out all of my own decisions and opinions about life and politics. And I do have serious doubts, ambiguities about certain moral questions. Ordinary intelligence cannot see that, if it could even go this far, that all of that together constitutes a collection. It constitutes a society in me. It is a tribe. Not just that which I think I know, but that which I'm not sure I know. Not just that which I think is true, but that which I definitely think is not true. All taken together is a society. And that society, if they could see it, which ordinary intelligence can't, but if it could see it, then it would not simply see this collection of conflicting, doubtful, opposing, sometimes agreeing. It would not see simply this mishmash as being a collection of individual, perhaps unrelated ideas, opinions, thoughts. It would be something else. In the same way that society is something else. It is not a collection. It is not merely a collection of individuals. I repeat, even when I say society, now you can take it down lower. I'm not going to give exact numbers, but I gave you a good little index, if you heard it, that if a group of people become temporarily important enough to life that they get named and somebody begins to find fault with them, in other words, it's alive, it may only last a month or a year, 100 years, but that group is at the level I'm talking about. The group itself was not a collection, and I'm not giving you a special number, but I'm sure you think of, most people would, a society as being in the millions of people. You could have a group a lot less than that. A lot less. You could have just a group of people somewhere. But if that group of people becomes a kind of living importance to life, that is, that it takes on a name, not only has to be the most important thing going in that society, but if this just group of people gets big enough that it has a name, that people identify it, that some other people outside the group say, oh yeah, I know about them, and there's some opposition to them. No matter who it is, what the opposition, there's got to be opposition or it's not important to life. It's not growing. It's not going to go anywhere. But if that happens, it could be a fairly small number of people. But that small group then is no longer, it is not simply, let's say that the number is x12, x to the 12th power. You do not count x to the 12th power and say, all right, that group of people is made up of da 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 da, etc. It is not. The collection is now a different creature. It's always true, and it has everyday pertinence. And few people, it's new on this tape when I say pertinence. This does not mean that I'm pointing out something that's so important that if you don't ever see it, it'll adversely affect your life. If you don't ever see it, it won't have any effect on your life. That's what being ordinary is, that nothing has any effect on your life. But for those of you who are not satisfied and have the potential, this has real cuteness to it. It has real info that just has seeped right through your gills like good fresh water all these years, and you never realized it. Some of you see, by the way, a little sidestep, when I said a little piece of my intro, that it's almost the kind of thing that you would not think would follow. That you would think, well, all right, collections of people. If we're talking about fairly mechanical behavior, if we're just talking about behavior, if you don't like mechanical, which I don't even like, everything is molecularly driven. Therefore, there is some kind of physiological, probably fairly predictable basis for everything. And so if that's true with an individual, then why do we even bother with a so-called course of study called sociology? Because all we're talking about is taking psychology and just jamming it all together. Because a group of people, if we're going to talk about, well, over here we're dealing with a group of middle-class white Protestants, and we're going to do a study. All that group is, or this guy is a bowling team. The team, all it is how many people are in there, or how many people's in that Protestant community I mentioned. If we're going to study them, actually all it is are the individuals. I mean, that's only reasonable. It's not dumb. What else is it? We're going to study the 2nd Avenue Presbyterian Church's men's bowling team, and it's got 20 members. How are you going to study? There's no such thing as the 2nd Street Presbyterian men's bowling team, right? There's no such thing as that. There's these 20 guys, and they make up the team. So the team, if we're going to speak about it in any intelligent manner, the team is simply the 20 guys. Now, I picked a pretty weak example, I'll agree. But let me tell you, if that 2nd Avenue or 2nd Street Presbyterian men's bowling team gets to be somebody, it is not those 20 people. There literally becomes, and don't stick with my bowling team, there literally becomes a new creature. Or if you want another way, there has been an additional dimension added to this, because it is not the 20 guys. Do you hear me? There's no other way to put it. The team doesn't exist. There is no such thing as the 2nd Avenue Presbyterian men's bowling team. There's no such thing as that separate from the 20 guys that make it up. And so the team is simply the collection of these 20 guys, right and wrong. And that's what's fun. Because ordinary consciousness cannot see that. But I gave you examples, if you heard it, that there is no way out of. I used society and doing things such as what would constitute murder, or how do you hold somebody responsible for what they do. It's not just that. Not just me using society on the basis of the judicial aspects of a collection of civilized people. Religion. The individuals cannot answer what happens after death. Let's use that one. Your forefathers used to have some areas of the world, they still do have some faith in religious teachings about life after death. Because our religions teach that there's a God outside this system that somebody created. Notice, no intellect, nobody, no St. Peter, no Muhammad, no Buddha, no anybody, including you, no human nervous system can answer satisfactorily. The Pope, anybody, they can't answer, do we live after we die? Or is there actually a God, some figure, something outside of us that made this, that was outside the system and then made the system external to himself? Nobody can answer that. But you get together a group, and by God it does. Now, notwithstanding the fact that some of you by now may say that you naysay your religion or say, I'm beyond all that. Okay. You're not ordinary anyway. Look out in life. It is accepted. Besides the kind of little nitpicking and that same kind of thing that goes on in their judicial questions. But note, it has been accepted by and large throughout history that a church somewhere, not just the Western church, but a church, continuing regurgitations, revisions of religions, or new religions pop up, and for that time and that place, somebody shows up, and it becomes a group, because the one individual won't make it. It has to become a group very shortly. Moses, his followers, Jesus, and all that. There comes out this message that, hey, blah, 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 blah. And they give a definitive answer to questions that no individual can answer. Now, I will also, since I gave you credit for not being ordinary, assume that you won't choke on the idea and say, well, like your father might have, well sure, the church can answer questions the individual can't, because God told them. Their molecules told them like everybody else. Forget whether God sent the message, or whether Western Union or the planet Jupiter. The group, once it got together, and also don't fall into some kind of sociological, architectural trap and say, well, wait a minute, it's the impact of getting a bunch of people and they go off in hiding, and then they come out and they raise money and they build a big old church and they wear funny clothes and light candles and wave wands, and then they say, God said after you die, such and such happens. Don't fall into that and say, well, it's the impact of the group. It's the impact of their trappings. That's the very kind of thing that life, when it's trying to fuck around with us, well, you know, how me tell you something like that and then stick its hand up some of you other people's knickers and make you go, oh, wait a minute, all that is, it's just kind of the larger impact that these groups have, because there's so many of them, they got more money than an individual. Don't fall for that. Don't trip along the way. It's just what I told you, that a group can take on, that is, it becomes more complex up to a certain degree, and it can take on an additional dimension that this group, generally referred to, I change the subject, to a church, a religion, can give an answer to that time and place, and the people go, wow. And they take the answer. I don't mean they're dumb. They weren't deluded. The answer was no more incorrect, if I got to point out crudely, than it is to say that it's incorrect to allow somebody to escape the death penalty when they have committed homicide if the judicial system, if the jurors, if that society, what it amounts to, decides that, well, under the conditions that you were in molecularly, when you did this, we're going to excuse you. That is no more incorrect than for you to fall into some very primitive wiring position to say, well, wait a minute, all religions are a bunch of junk, because just because a religion somewhere told the people that, well, God said so and so is true. And the people went, wow, I always wondered, and now we know. That is no more incorrect than it is to say, well, it's incorrect to let someone who was mentally unstable by their definition at that time and place, to allow them or to permit them to be held non-responsible, to be called insane. You can't say that's correct or incorrect, can you? Not if you're reasonable. You can say maybe you didn't like it, maybe you didn't agree, but you can't say, well, it's incorrect. If they define the game that you have got to meet certain kinds of intellectual standards to be held responsible, and they assume that most people in our society are sane. But if you're not sane at the time you do something that's forbidden, then we have made allowances for it. You can't call that right or wrong. You can't say, well, it's true or untrue. In the same way, you would be foolish if you think, well, groups of people somewhere, I don't care whether they're Jews, Muslims, or people you never heard of, some religion, if that society, that is that group of people, if they stay solidified enough and stable and life wants to use them, they get a name. They become alive. They get enemies down the road, some other part of the jungle. They become a living society. Sometime after that, they're going to start having laws governing their behavior, and they're going to start having some kind of religion without fail. But to say that their religion, or that the people, the individuals, were exceedingly dumb, not near as smart as you, just says all you need to know about your degree of intelligence right there. But just because, I just don't want you to fall into that kind of very primitive intellectual trap to say, well, a religion doesn't answer anything because people got to believe it, they got to have faith and all that. You're missing it. The religions come out and they do give, operationally, definitive answers to the people. No matter how silly it may sound to you at another time, another place, or just from another distance. Did you say, that's not my religion? That's foolish. It's not foolish. And that's not even the point. Remember, we're not here talking about religion tonight. It's sociology. That's who I was using tonight. Is the group. Now, it may appear in the beginning one guy, like a Muhammad or a Moses, but for it to fly, for it to take on life, it very quickly is going to become a group. And that group, forget the idea that God told them, the group, in the same way the judicial system does, the group, the society, comes up with answers that people take. They come up with the answer. They can decide, all right, here's what happens after you die. And the group says it, and the people go, wow. But the group that said that, the whole society, or what seemed to be the group that announced it, Muhammad, and a whole bunch of guys come out and say, well, all right, here's the latest thing from Allah. Here's what he says about murder. Here is when you're responsible for murdering someone, and here's where you're not. And they say it. If you're ordinary, and if you're trying to look at that, you could say, well, now wait a minute. They got together and decided. But individually, they can't decide. It's impossible. You can say, yeah, but in some way they did. No, they didn't. You can say, well, I bet if we'd been there, they discussed it. But no individual out of that, I don't care who he was, I don't care what he was called, and how he's thought of now after the fact, the individual has no ability to make certain decisions. That the wiring system of the individual cannot go past a certain point. Take a collection when life needs it, and it turns it into a group, a society, and magic happens, and no one notices it. No one ever questions it. Or if they do, they say, well, in religion, of course, they can say, well, the God sent this down and told the people. If it came to do with judicial matters, social mores, I guess they'd say, well, it's kind of the collective wisdom of our experience for the last several hundred years. We kind of grew up as a people. But you say, well, who grew up? Did you grow up? Can you answer that question individually? Well, no, that's what we got lawmakers for. I mean, we've got some nice men up there in Washington. They can decide stuff like that. So you think they're superhuman, they're some way different from you. Well, I don't know. I ain't got time for that. It's magic. A molecular collection of anything. See if you can take this right quick. It's a variation. Molecular collection of anything is not the same as the mere numerical combination of its individual parts. And we do not have to be talking now about what seems to be humans and groups. This is so easy to describe, and it's going to break my heart because I know that most of you are going to just look straight through me, that is through the words, and go, yeah, yeah, yeah. A collection, a molecular collection, which is the only kind of collections that can have any effect on you, of anything is not the same as the mere numerical collection of its parts. For instance, if we had bunches of little pieces of paper and we had all the words from Macbeth, each little slip of paper had one of the words from Macbeth, and we had them here on the stage. Every word. I mean, every time that thee is in Macbeth, we've got a slip of paper for thee. We have literally got every word of Macbeth, and they're here in a box. You do understand. Now don't just look blank like, well, come on, say something important. There. We didn't just copy the dictionary. Some of us sit down and we went line by line through total Macbeth and little slips of paper, and one at a time we copied every word and we put it there in that box. And there they are. You know that's not Macbeth. But yet look at it in another way. This is not just a verbal game I'm playing. From another view, that which runs through the intelligence of humanity without any operational definitive notice, in a way that I'm going to try to get you to see a little clearer if I'm trying to slip up on you, in a way that's never defined, even though you laugh at them, and there they are. You know that's not Macbeth. But yet look at it in another way. This is not just a verbal game I'm playing. From another view, that which runs through the intelligence of humanity without any operational definitive notice, in a way that I'm going to try to get you to see a little clearer if I'm trying to slip up on you, in a way that's never defined, even though you laugh at this now, in a way that's never defined and looked at, this does go on. But you also know this. We could have little slips of paper and have a musical note, have a piece of the staff so that you know where the note went. We could faithfully copy not just the full score of Beethoven's Ninth. Each little piece of paper had one note, and we put them all here in a box. That there is every note of the full thing, all parts, the full score, right there, one note at a time. You do know, sounds silly, but you know that that is not the same thing as Beethoven's Ninth. I mean, there's all the notes. Or instead of just on paper, if we could collect, which you can, but if we just collected the actual individual notes and put them on a disc, on a tape, and did them all, even all at the same time, and just suddenly played it. Now I went, bleh. All right. Now, at least two more steps. A person, an individual, is not merely the collection of the molecules that make him or her up. The last one that I'll do. The collection of the facts, the things you know, is not your intelligence. No. I did use a kind of subtle, all right, subtle ledger domain, because contorted my line of examples as I went from the individual words did not constitute the actual play Macbeth into Beethoven, then into the fact that an individual is not simply the collection of his molecular parts, into your intelligence is not merely the collection of what you know. Now it changed from the beginning to the end of those 4 examples, whether you followed it or not. There was a subtle shift in there, but in the beginning, even though I pointed out that people do not analyze or think about it this way, people do mistake the words in Macbeth for Macbeth, and they don't know it. If you ask them, if you found somebody and they were a fervent supporter, a fan of Shakespeare, it was one of their real secondary hobbies in life, and you said, well, now Macbeth is a play. I mean, it's a thing, it's a play, right? But forget about the actual performance of it. It's a play, and forget just us having it here in a portfolio that we can read it. It's here, all right? But it's also more, you could say to the guy. You say, yeah. The play Macbeth is, I mean, it's something itself. I mean, here we are, we're talking about Macbeth, and we don't even have a copy of it between us, just you and I are talking. And right now, Macbeth exists to you, doesn't it? And the person will say, well, yeah, certainly. Maybe they've got it memorized forward and backwards. If you say Macbeth is actually a thing, they say, yeah. And I'd say, well, it's more than, in fact, if we had every word from Macbeth copied on an individual piece of paper and we threw them in a box, that wouldn't be Macbeth, would it? And the person would go, ha, don't be silly, of course not. Then I'd say, okay, that does sound silly, but what is Macbeth other than that box full of words? And if they had anything pushing at the gravitational limits of ordinary earth thought, they would at least have to get to the point of go, oh my God. Because if you put it that way and you look at it, and I say, all right, you say Macbeth is something, that it's an actual thing, yes, and it's more than this box of words. It's every word that's in the play is in there. Well, sure, that's not Macbeth. All right. But what is Macbeth other than that? That is the same extreme limit of ordinary earth intelligence of having the question, are you responsible for what you do? Is there something in you that's more than a collection of unconscious, in the full sense, not psychological, that is pre-speech? You're nothing but a collection of pre-speech, non-verbal, non-conscious molecules, cells, proteins, keeping themselves alive inside of further subdivisions, collectively down in organs, massed together, run by the blueprint of your own DNA. Your liver does what it does, your heart does what it does, your blood does what it does, yeah. Your non-speech areas of the brainstem probably do what it does, you know, like being horny when you're asleep at night and dreaming, yeah. And then you start getting dangerous, because now you're about to push into the area that seems to be unique, into the area that seems to be inexplicable, that all this is going on. And if you look at it a certain way, there's no control over it. You can't say, for it's been trying, but you got to face it. You can't turn around and say, God, look at that woman. And you say, well, what is it you like about her? Then you can start rhapsodizing, or if you were a Mississippi bricklayer, I don't guess you'd rhapsodize much. You might say, God, look at those. You know. But if you could answer, you say, well, what is it you like about that woman? If we could get somewhere closer to a more, not closer to, if we get to an area of more enriched response, which is not ordinarily possible, suddenly certain collections of molecules in that man that said that if they could speak suddenly, they would say, of course there is no reason, but what they would say is that sensually, in this case probably almost totally visually, if they're driving by in a car, it's all visual, that kind of thing went into the eyes, got into the brain, and hit us in a particular place, that part in the brain that has to do with sexual excitement inside the nervous system. And if you ask the guy, why'd you make such a deal about that woman that just flew by? You just saw her for a second. Wow, did you see her? If those molecules could speak, they wouldn't have anything to say. But if they could speak, you said, why did you like her? Instead of him saying suddenly after the fact, well, I don't know, I've always liked blondes. If you said, why did you say that? The answer would be, a more enriched answer was, if all these little molecules could stand up, they'd just stand up some way and go, and what they'd be saying is, because we made him do it. Yeah, but that can't be true, because if that's true, then that box of words is actually Macbeth. And they can't help it. Yeah, but they ain't the same because they're not in order. Yeah, but you ain't in order. If you were in order, you were anybody, you could explain yourself. You would then have a definitive and acceptable answer as to why do you do what you do? Well, sometimes I think I know, and sometimes I don't. Well, when do you think you know? Well, it's always after the fact. I mean, after you ask me. Are you in order? Well, sometimes I seem to be, and sometimes I'm not. You mean, are you nothing more than just kind of blind drives that just runs a tiger or a dog? No. Really? Well, I'm not saying we don't have anything in common or that we don't have some kind of subliminal or nonverbal drives. I'm not saying that. What are you saying? Well, I don't know. Are you saying that you're more than your collective parts? Well, certainly. How do you know that? Then what do they say? If you really started pushing, the person was trying to play along, and I'm not being sarcastic, I'm playing a part now, sort of a five-dimensional Socrates, you might say. The creature, the man answering this, would have to finally say that the reason he knows that humans are more than just their collective, unconscious, animalistic, self-preserving drives, the reason they know that is how? What are they about to tell me? They're about to tell me what some group announced. Not what they know, because individually nobody knows. They're going to say, no, man is more than that. I hear what you're saying, and I'm not saying there's no validity to that. But the human being is much more than those kind of crude, aggressive, sexually driven, greedy, animalistic drives. A man is more than that. He's more than the sum of those kind of parts. Okay, I hear that you're convinced of that, but how do you know this? How did you develop this? Well, almost any religion will tell you that. No, I mean, how do you know that? Well, the religions say that, and most of the world's great philosophers, and they could start to throw in Plato. And I can say, well, how do you know it? Well, I've discussed it, I've thought about it, I've read books pro and con. But do you know that? And if that nervous system, which it can't, but if that man could give me a more direct answer, a more enriched answer, it would be what I started off telling you in the body of tonight's thing, that it cannot. And it's no real big secret that it can't. But what it cannot see is that then a collection of those that can't get together and can. Then when it gets necessary for life to use a more complex version of anything, people, animals, plant life, inert elements, the geology of this planet, when it happens and it reaches a certain point of complexity, it can take on an additional dimension, but it's never noticed by those involved unless your intelligence took on a likewise additional dimension. And it does not see that things that are accepted, you got no choice, things that are ordinarily accepted as being fact, reality, are magic, even in science, because it comes about through groups. It's like having a group a whole race of people with only a right leg, and you put them all together, and in some way they can enter a sack race. That you get a whole group of people, 100 or 100,000 people with none but left legs, and you put them all together, and suddenly nobody seems to notice it, but they take on a right leg. They can do things that the individual cannot do. Intelligence. I point out, even at the ordinary level, is more than the ordinary facts, stuff. Neural impressions made on your brain. Now, it does an ordinary person no good. But for this to work, it's got to do some good. That is, you have got to realize, you got to see for yourself, you got to be able almost again to be a piece of paper and somebody writes something on you and you can only see part of it. And to be able to hold up the paper, to fold your own brain over, as it were, and go, ah. You have to be more complex yourself. As you can see that there is an absolute limit to what this will do. And it's not personal. It is not individual. I see now that I can't do it because I see that the human nervous system, the human brain, cannot do that. It's not right or wrong. It's not a matter of education. The whole premise, that is, and this doesn't answer it, those of you who are getting good, and some of you are, this doesn't answer it, but this is the fastest way to tell it. The premise, that is, of asking whatever the question is, are we mortal or infinite? Is man free or is man captive? The premise of all of those, any question that an individual nervous system can't answer, the question was wrong. And that's incorrect. The question wasn't wrong. The question was proper. People are supposed to. The question can't be answered. That's not the way to put it. There is no such question. I'm getting closer. If there is no such question, how can I even repeat that I know that people ask that? I don't know. It is simply too complex to even talk about. How much time we got? 10 minutes. Picture this. I could make up all kinds of examples. Let's see. The Pope, Elvis. How about Juan Perón? I'm trying to think of something different. Or fill in Elvis, or here it goes. Listen to me. They're covering. They finally did bring him back to Argentina, didn't they? Here it is. There's where Juan and Eva are laid out. There's an Argentine observer there. The press is covering that day in and day out, 24 hours a day, there are groups of people, especially on Juan Perón's birthday. That today he would have been, whatever, 97 years old, and there are people there. They're bringing flowers, and people are bringing their children, and people are crying, people are fainting. There's somebody, a non-Argentinian, is there, and he's commenting about this phenomenon. We came down to cover it for Welch TV. Because we found this very interesting. How can you people believe the man was, they give his background and how he'd been arrested, and then you people even think he was a big deal and she was a prostitute, they say. They were just ordinary people. They couldn't. How is it that them, or the last Pope that died, or Elvis, the commentator asked this observer, this outside person, says, you know, it makes no sense to us that didn't grow up in this environment. How can you're treating these people like demigods, when as far as we know, all the information, they were just ordinary people? The Argentine, or if it was up in Memphis, this good American person with Elvis would be the same thing. But the Argentine might say, listen, I hear what you're saying. I know you're kind of laughing, but look. You look around, this goes on, it's bigger now on his birthday, but you look, 24 hours a day, there's a line of people coming in here, bringing flowers, crying, people faint. This outside reporter said, yeah, I know that, that's why I'm here. Listen to me. If the gods did not make Juan Perón or Elvis or a pope, a dead pope or somebody, if Juan Perón was not something special, extraordinary, then how, may I ask you, do you explain that day in, week out, month in, that these people come here and it has this effect? Now listen, don't jump in and be an ordinary critic, because you got to think about that. Because you might start out laughing, these people come up there and crying and people die, clutching Elvis's grave. If you find that to be more ludicrous than Juan Perón, and it's not. But if you think, my God, these people are idiots. And then somebody says, wait a minute, now you can say that. Maybe you didn't like Elvis's music. Maybe you didn't agree with Perón's politics. But listen to me. How do you explain that millions, literally millions of people, are still struck and affected by this man, even though he's dead, and they come here? And look at them. These people are not idiots. These people are doctors, lawyers, lots of working people, I'll admit that, but these people are not nuts. And look how they're affected. That man, Juan Perón, Pope so-and-so, Generalissimo so-and-so, that man was indeed something special, or he would not be having that kind of effect on these people. Now think about that. Did you think about it? All right. There is real walking around earth validity to that. Always. And take any other example. I tried to pick them about as far and wide from Elvis to Juan Perón. But anybody, there is no exception. But now, it could equally be said, the validity that I just as Strong suggested is there in the three-dimensional world of an observer, an apologist for a Perón or an Elvis or John Kennedy, to say for this large number of people to be affected in this way 50, 100 years, 1,000 years after the man's death, Christians with Jesus, Muslims with Muhammad, to say this man indeed was something special, or he would not still be having this effect on those people. It could equally be said that these people, that the gods have made these people behave like that, and that's why they behave like that. And you follow? Instead of saying that the gods in some way made that man, Perón, Kennedy, Elvis, special, or these people would not be acting like that. It would equally be true to say that life has made these people act like that is why they act like that. Do you hear me? Literally, even at the three-dimensional level, that is just as valid, just as descriptive. Exactly. But nobody ever does that. Why? Nobody even thinks along those lines. If I pointed it out, I could get some people to say, well, yeah, and they would agree to it. Yeah, you could say that. But nobody ever does. Why? Since we're running out, we only got 5 minutes, at least I'll give you a good hint. It lacks a clear focus. It lacks what seems to be an individual that creates a central focus to whatever this experience is. The collection of people cannot worship themselves. There has got to be the appearance of a central individual focal point. There would be no Christianity, and I don't trip on this, there would be no Christianity without a Christ, or a Jesusanity without a Jesus. There'd be no anything without there being apparently an individual central focus in the beginning. then, if it's going to survive, it becomes what? It becomes a collective phenomenon. You know, this is so transparent that I guess life didn't even care whether I drag some of this down. You understand, Perón is dead, Kennedy is dead, Elvis is dead. Just face it. They're dead. They're not here. Nobody's seen them. They're not around. They're not marching. They're not performing. They're not making speeches. And look, last time I read, the Elvis Presley estate is making more money now than it did last year he was alive. Kennedy's probably more popular. I know damn well Perón's more popular than he was when he was alive. So look, can you see in a sense that now the so-called worship of Elvis or Perón, or you can call it nicer things, but follow what I'm saying, that this now, in a sense, has nothing to do with Juan Perón. How can it? You can say, well, you can stop people there going by with flowers and crying, and somebody 20 years old, you say, well, hell, you weren't even alive when he died. They go, yeah, but that ain't it. Well, why are you crying? Well, he represented us. It was our aspirations, us poor people. No, that sounds fine. But you understand, it is not the collection of what he did in life, and it is not simply the collection of these individuals going by, and each and every one of them has some personal reason that they love and miss Juan Perón. Most of them never saw him. What is it going on? It is more than the collection of individuals participating in it. That all these things that seem to be, at least from some views, you could take a very cynical, if you're ordinary, critical, sarcastic view of, boy, look at those dumb rednecks, lowlifes, worrying about Elvis. Or look at those dumb foreigners down there, a guy that couldn't even run a country, he couldn't even hold himself together, and now they turn him into a demigod. You don't understand. It is now more than any combination of its parts. When things reach a critical level of complexity, life not is simply put together a new combination of individual parts. When it reaches the point that life needs it, it has created a new entity. There is now a creature and there's no name for it. Well, the closest is they say things like somebody, but it's always an attack. Notice this. We are out of tape. But somebody say, well, it's the Perón phenomenon. Or somebody say, well, it's the almost psychotic worship of John F. Kennedy. Or it's this kind of low intelligence, almost unholy worship of Elvis Presley. And it's not. That's the closest they can come to it, is call it some kind of odious, neurotic phenomenon, worshiping this dead guy. It's a whole new creature. There's no name for it. But it's not Elvis, he's gone. It's not Perón. It's not the people there. It's not the critics of the people there. There's a new creature, but it's an added dimension, and nobody can name it. They can't even see it. You need to see such things as that. That's why I brought it up tonight. We're completely out of tape, right? Fini. We're out of tape, or I'd keep talking. Yeah. Rolling. For you people out of town, a lot of you has already written me and asked me. I was going to try our grand opening, so-called, of Evotech as a science fiction playhouse. I thought the new play we're going to consider the grand opening, the next play, I was going to try and see if we could put together that and St. Quantum's Day, so that some of you can come right here and have one big party for opening night and St. Quantum's Day. But as it turns out, they seem too far removed, that the opening night is October 7th. So I've been told for the opening of the fall play. And St. Quantum's falls on the 23rd of September. So, after giving this serious consideration, it's a real hardship, but it looks like we're going to have two separate parties. I was going, if it had been closer together, I might have taken some liberties with St. Quantum's Day, and I thought I'd been safe as to just arbitrarily moved it and hold it on the same Saturday as the opening of the new play and just have one big one. but even I don't feel comfortable with a 2-week span of putting them together. It's just not right. I mean, when you make up something, you got to stick with it. So it's going to be a hardship on many of us, but I never said life was not without its little stresses. So we're going to have a party on the 23rd, that Saturday, and then whatever it is, 2 weeks, I guess, later we're going to have another one. I don't know. So we just have to do our best. So you're out of town, get down here if you can either night, but I guess you would probably enjoy the opening night party and to see the new theater. Those of you who have already been here, and the work that some of the mad men and women here are doing on the physical plant of our theater, not to mention the kind of havoc that may be wreaked upon the intellects of the poor unsuspecting public that may show up here again. Other than that, keep your fields watered.